Alexandr Dugin's book titled The Foundations of Geopolitics is often referred to as being, if not the blueprint for Russia's imperialist behavior, then at least the articulated version of the thinking behind it. This book does not only explain the reasoning behind the currently ongoing invasion attack to Ukraine, but it paints a picture how this attack is just one part of a much larger plan, where many actions have taken before Ukraine war and even more are lined up after it. That is, if Russia can have their way and execute their plans without anyone stopping them. Many people have heard of this book or read second-hand commentaries on its contents, but I claim that most have missed just how truly appalling the plans are that Dugin is advocating here. I'd wager that many expect that the absolute worst thing that could happen to them or to their country would be the spread of Ukraine-like war onto their countries or getting assimilated into a Soviet Union-like dystopian society. But I claim that this book is painting a much worse outlook for the countries around the world, even compared to what Ukraine is enduring right now or what life was like in the USSR. Many of the most sinister plot twists of the book are written in a very subtle way, and only if you stop and read them through carefully can you appreciate their true nature. For example, to me as a Finn, I had simply assumed that the Russians would only want to conquer and annex us. But the fate that Dugin is planning for us is next-level nightmare fuel, far exceeding the inconveniences of war and annexation. And that's not even close to being the worst part of the book. In order to do justice to the true nature of this book and to the line of thinking it represents, I find it necessary to avoid the temptation to directly jump to bullet point executive summary conclusions. In order to prove that I'm not making this stuff up or drawing biased conclusions in an attempt to paint this book or Russians in a bad light, I will be utilizing numerous direct quotes from this book to back up my conclusions along the way. The downside of this all is, though, that this will take time, and it will require multiple videos to properly go through and convey what this book is really trying to say. The term geopolitics is commonly used by politicians and commentators, but it has very different meaning to different people. For people of democratic societies who have no hostile intentions towards their neighbors, it's important to grasp just how fundamentally differently many policymakers from imperialist countries can perceive the essence of geopolitics, most notably how Russian ruling elite sees it. Personally, I had previously cursive understanding on the main ideas of geopolitics and how Russians see it, but all this was based on second-hand commentaries. My take on it had been that it was just a harmless power fantasy that gave them a possibility to feel good about themselves and get out of bed in the morning and cope with the realities waiting outside the front door. But when Russian top leaders and foreign policymakers started to more and more frequently and more openly use geopolitical rhetoric and deploy terminology like Atlantists and multipolar world, I started to take this more seriously. Maybe this was not just a harmless power fantasy after all. Maybe influential policymakers were actually believing in this thing and pursuing active efforts to act upon it. And then Russia attacked Ukraine and argued it using geopolitical rationale and terminology. And then they started to carry out ethnic and cultural genocides according to a clear and premeditated game plan. The excrement had just gotten tangible. So I decided to take a closer look at this thing called geopolitics to see firsthand what this is all about. I was looking to better understand what the Russian ruling elite were thinking when they attacked Ukraine and started ethnic mass murder campaigns against people with whom they had previously had so much in common. I was also interested in better understanding that if there was a bigger picture and what possible next steps on the horizon could be. What I found was deeply disturbing, but at the same time it gave a framework to make many pieces click together on what had appeared to be seemingly unrelated, irrational and unethical things different big players were doing, not only Russia, but also in the United States, Germany, China and beyond. Eventually, it led to new disturbing insights why the war in Ukraine has evolved the way it has, and scenarios how the war in Ukraine is likely going to evolve going forward. These scenarios I have not spotted being explicitly mentioned out loud in any public commentary mentioned in the news or by officials, but still scenarios that appear to be eerily consistent with the real-life actions and developments taking place on both sides of the Atlantic. But more on these takeaways and scenarios towards the end of the discussion after we had first discussed the topic of geopolitics more broadly than in the context of just one war. And as a spoiler sneak peek, yes, in the end Ukraine will win, but many agree that the single most important Russian geopolitical author is a chap called Alexandr Dugin, and that his most important book is called The Foundations of Geopolitics, published in 1997, that is claimed to be influential among Russian policymakers and enforcers. Note especially the year of publication, 1997. Keep this in mind when we go through the thesis and proposals he outlines in this book and compare that against the actions and events that have taken place since then. The unnerving amount of parallels of this book versus things taking place in reality gives credibility, at least in my opinion, that also the further steps and the bigger picture outlined in this book are something that Russia would very much like to see come into reality, if given the opportunity. And wow, there is a lot to unpack in here. I had read second-hand commentaries and references of this book, but there is so much more than any and all second-hand commentaries I had read previously had even hinted at. This is so much worse than I had ever even feared or considered possible. And because of how appalling it is, I found it important that people should get a more direct grasp of its contents and the possibility to see just how horribly and differently other people's morality and thinking can operate. This book gives new perspectives and context to many global political events and actions that are nihilistic, Machiavellian, yet compelling and consistent once you throw morality and human values out of the window. But most importantly, it led me to new conclusions and predictions of what will happen in Ukraine, Europe, and beyond that are unlike anything I had found in other public and articulated sources. Let's recap quickly who exactly this Dugin character really is. Is he just a Unabomber wannabe whose scribblings have no relevance or impact in real life? Or does he have audience and resonance with persons of actual power in Russia? Dugin does not appear to be mainstream in Russia, at least not as an individual, but despite some conflicts and fallings out of favor with the authorities in his youth, Dugin appears to have solidified the access to the ear of persons with genuine power in Russia, parliamentary, military, and evidently even presidential. The structure of Dugin's book appears at first to be very convoluted. He keeps spreading logically connected topics like what is Russia's big plan? What are they thinking? What next? What about Ukraine, Finland, USA, EU, or China? To different chapters throughout the book. For example, in the book, Ukraine is covered under sections like Near Abroad and Civil War, and Finland makes an appearance in Threat of the West and People of the South. At first, it appears quite hard to keep track what the message really is until you notice that each time he comes back to discuss a previously covered topic, the discussion has become a bit more unhinged than the last time it was visited. So instead of viewing the book as a linear discussion from start to finish, it helps to view it as a spiral towards progressively deeper layers of lunacy. I will do my best to spare you from this spiral and consolidate the logically connected topics from different parts of the book and present them in a closer relation to each other. In the following, I'll be covering the contents and messages of these books under the following topics. I will be arranging the topics in such a way that they paint a context and motivation, but also in a way that makes the topics get wilder and wilder the further down we go. For example, if you think that the law of expansion makes you raise your eyebrows, wait until we cover the ideology for the empire. Or if you think that the plans for Ukraine or Europe are displeasing, wait until we get to China. And in this first video, we'll be covering what is geopolitics. And here we'll be explaining where the idea came from, what turns it led to its imperialist forms, and explaining key terminology like thalassocracy and world island or planetary dualism that are necessary to keep track with Dugin's rationale. In the next video, we'll be covering what is Russia's big plan and explaining how Dugin argues the inevitability of consolidating Eurasian power and why it should have an empire as its governing structure and why Russians, of all people, should be the ones leading it. Then we will move on to cover how Dugin plans to gather the empire. In this section, we will include region and country-specific plans to seize power. For example, under the West section, we'll be taking a look at what Dugin says about Ukraine or Finland, and in the East section, we'll be covering China. And after this, we'll be covering how he plans to stabilize the empire. Here we will be covering the planned governing structure and practices, as well as the ideology needed to keep things under control and Russians on top of it all. Finally, we will move on to the synthesis part of the discussion. First, we'll discuss why it will fail. While I will be providing spot-specific criticism throughout the previous sections, I will combine and discuss the most fundamental flaws in the premises of Dugin's thinking to this section. I will go even so far as to propose what Russia should do differently if they would really want to gain traction towards their goal of consolidating and deploying Eurasian power. Finally, I will be providing my take on the predictions and implications of the war in Ukraine. Based on the previous sections and developments in Ukraine war, I will be making an interpretation why the war has evolved the way it has, as well as estimate where things are currently heading and what different players like EU should do in the case they are not complacent with this direction. In order to prove that I am not exaggerating or drawing unfounded conclusions or intentionally aiming to portray the book's thesis in a bad light, I will be covering these topics by including numerous direct quotes from the book. I believe that the direct quotes are necessary to convey the essence and the morality of this book, as they are such that you can't make this stuff up, at least not if your moral compass is working properly. The whole idea of geopolitics starts from the seemingly neutral premise that geography influences politics. This starting premise is easy to accept. Think of a coastal nation, say the Netherlands, that creates much of its wealth via trading, so politics there need to ensure favorable conditions for the prosperous trade. Or think of a nation with a fragile ecosystem, say Iceland, whose policies need to balance the fine line between productivity and sustainability. But beyond this initial starting point, the different branches of geopolitics take different turns and end up in different places. It won't be feasible to cover all the different variations of geopolitics here. Instead, I'll be focusing on the rabbit hole that Dugin and like-minded imperialists have fallen into. This rabbit hole sees geopolitics as the single most important determinant for humanity, politics, and planet. All other factors of humanity are considered transitory and of lesser importance. The geopolitical position of a state is much more important than the feature of the political structure of the state. Politics, culture, ideology, the nature of the ruling elite, and even religions are considered in geopolitical optics as important but secondary factors compared with the fundamental political principle, the attitude of the state to space. The branch that Dugin follows brings in elements of biology and evolution theory into the mix. More specifically, that the geography of a particular area determines what is necessary for the survival of the people living there, and consequently, what kinds of characteristics and behaviors can be expected to be found from the people who have been able to secure themselves a long-lasting presence in a given area. Again, this step is feasible to accept. If an area is suitable for raiding and military actions, say open plains with plentiful food, the people living there need to be skilled in defending themselves or better at raiding others than others are at raiding them. If, however, the area is inhospitable and resources are scarce, say high mountains, there's little reason to invest in active mass-scale aggressiveness, but instead low-intensity efficiency can allow people to carve out a living in an area where higher activity would lead to starvation. More formally, geopolitical authors such as Ratzel in the turn of 1900s have defined that states are considered as organisms that necessarily remain in contact with their soil and therefore must be studied from a geographical point of view. As the attentive person notices, this step into speaking of organisms and evolution puts the geopolitical reasoning into a slippery slope towards very, very dark places. From here, it's easy to start drawing follow-up parallels from biology and apply them to states and politics. Ratzel formulated this step in his law of expansion, which states that the attitude to the state as a living organism implies a rejection of the concept of inviolability of borders, and more specifically, the state expands and absorbs political units of lesser importance. Carrying out its spatial expansion, the state seeks to cover the most important regions for its development: coasts, river basins, valleys, and generally all rich territories. The initial impulse of expansion comes from the outside, since the state is provoked by the expansion of the state or territory with a clearly lower civilization. The general tendency to assimilate or absorb weaker nation encourages an even greater increase in territories in a movement that feeds itself. So this reasoning uses euphemisms like absorb, spatial expansion, and assimilate to argue the necessity for murders and genocides of unimaginable scales as if they were as impersonal and unavoidable phenomena of nature as apple falling to the ground because of gravity. And to add insult to injury, the blame for the horrors that this causes is assigned to the victim countries as their weakness and lower level of civilization is seen to provoke and demand the unavoidable invasion by the higher civilization. Throughout the book, Dugin keeps following this logic of blaming others for the invasions and horrors Russia does or would like to do. Unsurprisingly, Russell's theses have been criticized as being catechisms for imperialists, but for genuine imperialists like Dugin, this only serves as inspiration. For the rest of us, though, is still highly relevant to understand as it allows us to grasp just how fundamentally different the other can think and see the world. For imperialists like Dugin, borders and other contracts are nothing unless backed up by a credible force capable of enforcing them. Concessions do not satisfy their appetite. They will see concessions as means for political units of lesser importance or as characteristics of clearly lower civilization. They will not stop until they are stopped by a political unit of sufficient importance. Invader has the ethical high ground. It is the victim who is to blame for any and all moral shortcomings. Not all lines of geopolitical thinking, even the imperialist ones, are quite as sinister as the one Dugin is drawn to. The most important alternative line of thinking is based on Mahan's thesis that main policy tool is trade. Military operations should only provide the most favorable conditions for the creation of a planetary commercial civilization. These competing geopolitical views of increasing power by capturing Lebensraum via military expansion versus creating power via efficient trading are the single most important factors in the further steps in Dugin's geopolitical thinking. Dugin is firmly believing that the ultimate, most stable geopolitical power distribution endgame is planetary dualism, which he sees is comparable with the law of universal gravity in physics. This planetary dualism sees that things like countries and ideologies are simply superficial transitory manifestations of the larger forces that are fundamentally dictated by geography. More specifically, this dualism predicts that a stable planet-wide endgame will be one where one power center will dominate American continents and another dominates Eurasia. This bipolar power distribution is then stabilized by Atlantic and Pacific oceans that make it logistically unfeasible for either one of these power centers to further invade the other to pursue uniting the entire planet under one power structure. Other regions, such as Africa and South America, are given fleeting side notes of this worldview and are treated as spoils of war that the dominant power centers are free to exploit as they see fit. But in the bigger picture, the real game, the only planet-wide game that matters, is the contest between America and Eurasia. These geopolitical authors further assume that another of these power centers will rely heavily on oceans, logistics, and trading for its influence, wealth, and power, whereas the other one will derive its strength from land and natural resources. In geopolitical jargon, the ocean-based power center is referred to as thalassocracy, i.e. power from the sea, whereas the land-based power center is referred to as tellurocracy, i.e. power from the land. The specific contemporary names of these power centers like Russia and USA, or the ideologies that they deploy, like capitalism, democracy, kleptocracy, are seen irrelevant as long as they provide sufficient differentiation and identity in comparison to the other power center. As geopolitical authors like Dugin see it, this stable endgame is currently only half realized. One power center has indeed emerged and seized dominant status over the American continent, relying heavily on oceans and trade to generate wealth and exercise its power. This power center happens to carry the name of the United States of America and having a powerful sidekick, the United Kingdom, and happens to deploy values like democracy, capitalism, human rights, individualism, commerce, and justice system to articulate identity. The other power center that's expected to emerge in Eurasia has not yet manifested itself, although Soviet Union was seen having come close. Dugin sees that the Cold War was in fact World War III that was waged between thalassocracy, the USA, and tellurocracy, the USSR. After USA won the Cold War, it has been able to deploy multiple safeguards like sanitary cordons and anaconda strategies that Dugin sees as instruments for repressing the convergence of Eurasian power to an efficient entity that would be able to challenge each power, thereby creating an artificially suspended unipolar world with only one globally effective superpower. But we'll be coming back to discuss these more in a moment. Throughout the book, Dugin takes this planetary dualism to paranoid, conspiracy theorist extremes, assuming that every single action taking place anywhere at any time can always be traced back to either thalassocracy or tellurocracy. He does not see any possibility that actors like China, Turkey, India, or Nazi Germany could ever be acting on their own, following their own aspirations, but all of them are and always have been ultimately just puppets of thalassocratic USA. And when tellurocracy fails to achieve something he prefers, it is always due to the thalassocratic lobby's covert actions, never the mistakes Russia makes or the fundamental flaws in the ways it operates. Some geopolitical authors go even further to propose that the true, final, most stable power endgame could lead to one planet-wide power center. This line of thinking is called mondialism. Think United Nations on steroids. For Dugin, the word mondialism refers to all things evil, and he spends much ink in dismissing it. He sees that mondialism would at best make Russia one player among many, and at worst pawn to US. This is of course unacceptable because it is the Russians that he would like to see ultimately running the show on a planet-wide level. Earlier geopolitical authors before Dugin developed the term of world island to view Eurasia and Africa not as continents but as one massively big island. Furthermore, this world island is seen to consist of heartland and rimland. Heartland is the center north of Eurasia that is seen as the natural fortress protected against invasions by Arctic Sea, Gobi Desert, Himalayan mountains, and such. The only weak direction allowing access to this fortress is from the west, and granted, Napoleon and Hitler made efforts to exploit this. This weakness makes Russians paranoid, which is one reason for their aspiration to prioritize building defensive buffers towards west. Rimlands, on the other hand, are the regions positioned on the Eurasian continent beyond the Heartland fortress, closer to ocean. Africa is discussed only very briefly with this view that it has no proactive role in the contest for Eurasian or world power, but that it's just waiting passively for the big boys to sort out their affairs and then show up to exploit them as they see fit. Earlier geopolitical authors, especially Mackinder, argued that for the state, the most advantageous geographical position would be a middle, central position, and heartland is the concentration of the continental masses of Eurasia. This is the most favorable geographical base for the control over the whole world. Mackinder finally arrived at the conclusion that the one who controls Eastern Europe dominates the heartland. The one who dominates the heartland dominates the world island. The one who dominates the world island dominates the world. Unsurprisingly, Dugin is very, very fond of this conclusion. Further on, he continues to deploy the term of geographical axis of history when referring to Russia-controlled heartland to articulate how unavoidable and predestined Russia is to conquer all of Eurasia and ultimately the world. Dugin argues that as Russians occupy this heartland fortress, they are the only rightful instigators to drive and eventually dominate the unification of Eurasian power under one empire. Competing interpretations of the heartland versus rimland relevance have been proposed, most notably by Speakman, as he concluded that he who dominates rimland dominates Eurasia. He who dominates Eurasia holds the fate of the world in his hands. Of these two, it's easy to lean towards Speakman's interpretation of rimland's higher importance, for example by looking at nighttime satellite maps. If heartland really is so advantageous, why is no one living there? Why do people, prosperity and power tend to focus on rimlands instead? China appears to be betting on rimlands as the deciding factor as they are working to build their colossal Belt and Road project. But we'll be coming back to this as China in a bit further down the line. But these questions and real-life facts don't bother Dugin much. He cherry-picks data points and arguments that support the conclusion that he has already chosen in advance. What's more is that he single-mindedly fixes on the same idea that plagues most geopolitical authors, namely that the place and culture that they happen to be born in just miraculously happens to be the best and most privileged on the planet. Many geopolitical authors and actors on both sides of the Atlantic and over several centuries share the same idea that there is a massive unrealized power potential in Eurasia. For example, the last hour of Anglo-Saxon politics will strike when Germans, Russians, and Japanese unite. Or the main strategic objective of the United States is to prevent the creation of a large and independent strategic entity in the territory of the former Soviet Union capable of pursuing a policy independent of the United States. This implies that the current state of the world with one global superpower is an artificially maintained labil structure, and a more stable planet-wide power endgame could be possible if Eurasians got their act together and created an independent power consortium of their own. This reasoning sees that the US is deploying various methods to artificially repress the power potential in Eurasia, for example by confining Russia to land borders that are more resource-intensive to defend than USA's ocean borders. It's tragicomical that Dugin does not see the conflict in his own rationale. Is the heartland location an asset or a liability? Is it a fortress or a prison? Kissinger's linkage doctrine that Dugin refers to as the Anaconda strategy, where US builds close trading and political connection with the coastal rimland countries, and thus limits Russia's ability to conquer its way out of their fortress onto ocean borders. It is quite telling of Dugin's narrow-mindedness that he fails to see the positive net-sum game US is able to bring to the table via trading, and why that is more appealing than the assimilation and absorption of clearly lower civilizations that Russia would be bringing if given the opportunity. The creation of a sanitary cordon of countries in Eastern Europe between Russia and unambiguously pro-West countries. This again provides a window to Dugin's state of mind where he is simply incapable of comprehending the possibility that some countries could consciously choose not to invade others, even if they had the means to do so. So, the big plan for Russia is that they feel burdened by a higher cause to overcome these suppressive methods and to create a Russian-led power center to dominate Eurasia and Africa, an empire that rivals and outcompetes USA to become the stronger of the two remaining superpowers on the planet. Throughout the book, Dugin seemed mostly complacent in kicking USA out of Eurasia, crippling its economy and causing its collapse to the point where it cannot challenge or threaten the Russia-led empire's supremacy. However, he hinted that Russia should not forget aspirations beyond the world island. The Eurasian project involves Eurasian expansion into South and Central America with a view of removing it from the control of the North. The new empire must be Eurasian, great continental, and in the future, world. The battle for world domination of the Russians did not end. He does not dare to even entertain the possibility to directly attack in USA, not even in his most acid-trippy power fantasies. Instead, he dreams about an internal combat collapse, much like what happened to the Soviet Union. So, to recap, the big plan Dugin advocates for Russia is no more, no less than weakening USA's position with Rimland and other allies, using allies to capture and split areas where USA's influence is compromised, consolidating Eurasian power to Russia and Russia alone, even if it means backstabbing previous allies, gaining control of Africa and South and Central America, gaining world domination. Before moving ahead to review further details of this proposed game plan for building and running this empire, it's good to take a step backwards and look at this whole geopolitics thing once more. Geopolitics authors and actors like to think of themselves in a very grandiose ways. They tend to feel that they are uniquely capable of seeing the biggest of pictures and constructing the widest reaching of strategies. For example, Lauhausen believes that political power has a chance to becoming long-lasting and stable when rulers think not in momentary and local categories, but in millennia and continents. Dugin himself proceeds to put people like himself onto a pedestal by stating that geopolitics, in essence, are those people who, with the greatest of insight and responsibility, are able to recognize the historical trends and global developments in the spatial sphere, understand the place of their state and their people in this context, and formulate a reasonable and most effective project for the future. Therefore, they so often directly or indirectly affect the world history, which, however, is carried out by completely different forces, groups, parties, leaders, acting under completely different, momentarily relevant slogans. Previous geopolitical authors have been criticized that their considerations serve only to justify the rival aspirations of the authorities in relation to certain territories and the people inhabiting them. After World War II, Carl Schmitt was charged as being Hitler regime's war criminal by providing a theoretical justification of the legitimacy of military aggression. I would recommend keeping this criticism in mind when we move on to the next parts to cover how Dugin envisions this plan could be carried out. If Dugin's visions were to come true, it would make atrocities like Holocaust, Holodomor, or Nanjing massacre look like mere inconveniences. If you found the ride so far interesting, make sure to tune to the next section, where we'll be covering the main outlines of the big plan Dugin envisions to Russia. Until now, we've been just laying the pieces onto the chessboard. From here on, the ride is only starting to pick up speed when we uncover how he proposes these pieces should be moved around the board. First, we'll be covering how he argues the necessity of having empire as the governance structure for the consolidated Eurasian power. But most importantly, we'll be covering in detail the rationale and imperative he articulates for Russians to act upon this initiative. This will help us paint a picture of what trade-offs or compromises would be sufficient for Russia to halt the imperialist aspirations. Finally, we'll be taking a quick look at the plans he is proposing to Russia to be cascaded to different geographical directions.